All right, Underdog drafts are back. So I want to dive in very deep into roster construction and overall strategy that you should have in these tournaments and try to come up with some overall conclusions of how we are going to be attacking this going into the future. So the first thing I want to talk about is just going to be the amount of players at each position that you should look to draft. I'm going to make an entire series about this. So I think we're going to keep this one short and simple. It's easiest to start off at quarterback. I think it's going to be very important to follow along with what we're doing here because this is going to be something that we carry over to running back, wide receiver, tight ends, and then we can dive deeper and deeper and deeper. But I want to at least understand the overall format that we are looking at. So we are using the RotoViz best ball advance rates here from Underdog Fantasy. And what we are doing is we are looking at advance rates based off the amount of players that you drafted at an individual position in your draft. So this first chart, to explain it, this is the amount of quarterbacks that you drafted on your team and your expected advance rate through the past 3 seasons in these Underdog tournaments. So there were, say, a little over 9,000 teams that only drafted one quarterback, and only 12.4% of those teams made it to the playoffs. So that tells you, I mean, if you want to make it to the playoff tournament, you probably shouldn't only be drafting one quarterback. You should probably take more than that, right? We go over and look at, okay, well, it's not just getting to the playoffs. We know a lot of money is up for grabs week 17. We want to get to week 17 and we want to have the best chance at winning it. So for you to advance past the first round of the playoffs, you have a 1.09% chance if you draft one quarterback, which is not great. And then to make it past the semifinals, so to make it all the way to the finals, you have a 0.03% chance if you draft one QB. So the answer is you do not only draft one quarterback in Underdog drafts. Everybody watching this already knows it, but I just want to make sure that we cover that so we can look at the best example or a clear example. Now, really, the question is in these Underdog drafts, are you going to be drafting 2 or 3 quarterbacks, right? I don't want to waste your time. Obviously, you look at these advance rates. We know drafting 4 quarterbacks is very bad, both from getting to the playoffs, advancing round 1 of the playoffs, and advancing to the final tournament in the playoffs. Final round of the playoffs. We know drafting 5 quarterbacks, even worse. We know drafting 6 quarterbacks is worst of all. For the love of God, make sure that you are essentially only drafting 2 to 3 quarterbacks in these Underdog drafts. We're not breaking any massive news here. I mean, you can see that, 735,000 teams have drafted only 2 quarterbacks. You've had 497,000 teams draft 3 quarterbacks, and then only like 39,000 teams draft 4. Okay, so everybody already knows you're only wanting to draft 2 to 3 QBs. Now, between these rates, what's actually interesting is it does look like the 2 quarterback builds have been slightly more advantageous every step of the way. You have slightly more 2 quarterback builds making it to the playoffs at 16.9% in comparison to 16.6% with 3 quarterback. You have more 2 quarterback builds advancing past the first round of the playoffs. You have 1.48% of those teams in comparison to only 1.23% of 3 quarterbacks. And then you have more teams advancing all the way to the finals at 0.09% versus a 3 quarterback build of 0.08. So if we are just looking at the numbers and you think that we can just optimize off this and this alone, it is going to tell you we should probably be drafting 2 quarterbacks in comparison to 3 QBs. Now, both are still very viable. We're talking about tiny differences in terms of the overall percentage. So what I would say is you know what, looking at this data, it probably makes a little more sense for you to stay flexible. Maybe we go into the draft and we say, okay, well, we're going to target an elite level quarterback. If I can get Mahomes, Lamar in round 4, if I can get Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts at the 3-4 turn, maybe based off this data where we know 2 quarterback builds are a little bit more advantageous, maybe we go ahead, we pull the trigger on getting one of those elite level quarterbacks. So we set ourselves up only having to draft 2. Now, of course, if you're waiting until your first quarterback's Matthew Stafford, you're not only drafting 2 quarterbacks just because this data says it. You still want to make sure that you are drafting 3. So we already know if you grab an elite guy, you only have to draft 2. If you wait until the end, you're going to have to draft 3 no matter what. So this data kind of tells us maybe it's a little more advantageous to grab that elite level quarterback in these Underdog drafts every step of the way. But what I also want to do is I want to go down both different paths and say, okay, say you drafted an elite quarterback and you only take 2 QBs. Or say you waited very long and you grabbed 3 total quarterbacks. Afterwards, what's the best decision that you can make in terms of the amount of running backs, wide receivers, tight ends that you're drafting? So if you're looking at the running back split, you're looking at teams that only drafted 2 quarterbacks in their underdog draft, right? So that's what this graph's going to be. And there were about 57,000 teams that drafted 2 quarterbacks and only 4 running backs. And if you're looking at this data, it says this is probably not a smart strategy, right? You're only going to make it to the playoffs in about 15.2% of instances. And it makes sense because if you're only drafting 2 quarterbacks, you don't really need to save an extra roster spot by only drafting 4 RBs. You're only going to allocate, say, 6 total roster slots across quarterback and running back if you do that. And then all of a sudden, you have 12 roster spots to divide between tight end and wide receiver. Probably not advantageous. I know a lot of people, especially back 2 years ago, because this is what won Best Ball Mania right out the gate, really like the hyper fragile running back builds where you only take 4 RBs and maybe you grab a couple elite guys early. But if you are doing that, it looks to be more advantageous if you are doing so with I just don't like it. Maybe a 3 quarterback build. But anyway, going over to what we are looking at, if you only draft 2 quarterbacks, you actually have RB 5 and 6 counts making the most sense here. If you draft 6 running backs, you are most likely out of any of these outcomes making it to the playoff tournament. But if you only draft 5 running backs, while you're a little less likely to make it to the playoff tournament, you're a little more likely to advance past round 1. Now, all the outcomes are about the same to make it to the finals at 0.09%. So ultimately, you want to stay flexible. But based off this data, what I would say is, okay, well, if we draft 2 quarterbacks, we probably can afford to take 6 RBs, right? Because the 2 quarterback, 6 running back build, that's going to get past the first round of the playoffs 1.47% of the time. Whereas if we cross-reference this with the 3 quarterback, 6 running back builds, there, instead of making it to the playoffs 1.47% of the time, it's only going to be making it to the playoffs 1.17%. So if you take the extra quarterback, you have 3 QBs, you probably want to go a little bit slimmer with running back, and you're going to be a little more willing to instead go with the 5 RB build on a 3 quarterback team. Now, going over and looking at this at wide receiver, obviously we're looking at it through the same lens, right? If you only draft 2 quarterbacks, it really doesn't make sense at all for you to only take 6 wide receivers. You can afford to take more. If you only take 6 wide receivers on a 2 quarterback build, you're only making it to the playoffs in 16.4% of instances. You're only making it past round 1 in 1.17%, and you're only making it to the finals in 0.06%. So if you're only drafting 2 quarterbacks, you definitely want to be going a little bit further, and you either want to be taking 7 or 8 receivers. What's really interesting is you can honestly make an argument for 9 wide receiver builds on a 2 QB team. If you're looking at the playoff rate, your best odds of making it to the playoff tournament will be if you only take 7 wide receivers on your 2 QB build, but your best odds of making it past round 1 of the playoff tournament will be if you take 9 wide receivers. So I think we're probably going to call it a happy medium where if you're taking 2 quarterbacks, I'm probably looking at about 8 wide receivers that I want to be drafting. Whereas if we're going over and looking at if you draft 3 quarterbacks, instead, it looks like the data has you a little more likely to make it to the playoffs and advance past round 1 of the playoffs if you take 7 wide receivers. So if you take the extra quarterback, you probably need to be taking away a receiver. And then going over to tight end, this is the main thing that I was interested in. On 2 quarterback builds, are we more likely to take the 3rd tight end, et cetera, et cetera? And here, if you are looking at 2 QB builds, you're more likely to advance to the playoff tournament with the 3rd tight end at 17.6% of the time. But your odds of making it to the finals are identical, whether or not you take 2 or 3 tight ends on a 2 quarterback build. And on a 3 QB build, it's pretty much the same thing. Your odds of making it to the playoffs are slightly boosted if you take the 3rd tight end, even on a 3 quarterback build. But your odds for the semis are pretty much identical, and your odds for the finals are pretty much identical. So what I was actually most interested to see is, how does it impact our advance rates if we take 2 quarterbacks, specifically if we're supposed to take 3 tight ends in that instance? Because I always kind of operate, okay, I want to allocate probably about 5 total roster spots to quarterback and tight ends. probably don't want to be taking 3 QBs and 3 tight ends. And the math shows that, honestly, it doesn't really matter too much. Outside of, if you're looking at running back, wide receiver, if you take the extra QB, you probably should not take, I don't know, not take 7 RBs. And if you take the extra QB, you probably should go for only 7 or 8 wide receivers in comparison to 9. But I hope this was useful at all for y'all. I mean, of course, I'm going to go through and I'm going to give you all the data as well at running back, wide receiver, tight end, talk through it in its entirety. But my takeaway from this is we probably want to be grabbing an elite level quarterback. We probably only want to be drafting 2 QBs. And when we do so, it opens up the ability for us to take like 9 wide receivers. But I think that's all I got for you. Hope that we were able to help out. And yeah, hope I get to see you out in the live stream sometime soon.